Oftentimes you might hear about people talking about the gray zone in running, and today we're going to unpack what that means, where is actually the gray zone, and hopefully you can take a bit of information from this and apply it to your training to become a better runner. Now you may be wondering, what is a gray zone? And it's broadly defined as the region or zone or pace range that you should try and avoid because you get minimal bang for your buck. So you're more kind of risking injury and not really getting the benefits in terms of the amount of effort that you put in. And depending on who you talk to, they'll have a different opinion on where the gray zone actually is, but a lot of people will say to you that the gray zone is tempo or threshold, or at least that used to be the case when I first got into running. But before we talk any more about the gray zone, we need to get a few things clear, and that is the training philosophy of a lot of different people throughout the years. But let's start simple and forget all the names of the people that invented the training philosophy, and we'll start with the pyramidal model. Now this is your classic, do a lot of base training and then do a little bit of threshold and then do, a tiny bit of speed work as like the icing on the cake kind of thing. And then there's your polarized model where it's like the 80-20 rule, do a lot of your running slow, but also a fair amount of your running fast, and then don't do that much in the middle. And that's where the people fit in, where they talk about how tempo and threshold is the gray zone and you want to go on either side of it to get the most amount of gains. And more recently, we have a lot of people doing the double threshold model where you spend a lot of time at threshold and also you still do a fair amount of base and you just do a little bit of speed as the icing on top. Now this is different to the pyramidal model in a sense still, because you're doing a little bit less base work and a little bit more threshold work than the pyramidal model. So those are your three main kind of intensity distributions that you would find people doing throughout a week. And interestingly enough, if you want to know my take on this situation, I think that it still kind of depends where you are in the season, because I wouldn't want to follow one sort of training philosophy in terms of intensity distribution throughout the entire year. I think it would kind of depend on how close you are to the marathon race, or what shape you're in right now. Is VO2 max holding you back, or is threshold holding you back? It comes back to all these factors that you need to consider when you program training for yourself. So I think there's no one perfect model, and that's why everyone's doing a ton of different stuff at different points of the year. Some people stick to one sort of training philosophy for the entire year and don't really change it up. But yeah, there's just a lot of ways to get around it. And at the end of the day, if you're still hitting a bunch of different splits, you probably will improve a fair amount. But that being said, a lot of people still love to talk about these sorts of training philosophies and intensity distributions. And now let's talk a little bit about the history of training and how it's changed over time. So in the 1950s to the 1970s, there was a guy called Lydiard, or that was his last name, I think. But he kind of got into the whole threshold thing. And although his training philosophy was basically the pyramidal model, it was slightly different in the sense that you would do a little bit more at threshold and maybe a little bit less speed, and still like a similar amount of base training. Whereas the pyramidal model is more a lot of base, very little threshold, and then kind of even less speed, I guess. So you get pointy towards the end. But the Lydiard model will have a slightly narrower base, a slightly wider threshold, and then pointy at the top, like the pyramidal model. So very similar. I guess you could almost think of them as the same thing as well. But a couple of decades later, we had a guy called Stephan Seiler come in and analyze a bunch of training for elite athletes. And he noticed a pattern where a lot of the top athletes were doing, a lot of base, most of their training at an easy intensity, and then a fair amount of training at fast as well. So they were kind of basically avoiding the middle zone, which is what became to be known as the gray zone for quite a long time. But what we know today is that threshold isn't really a gray zone. So what we're trying to work out in this video is, what is the actual true gray zone? So while people in the past would have argued that LT1 and LT2 is the gray zone, I would argue with my knowledge right now and say, I think that between LT2 and VO2 max is where the real gray zone lies. And the reason for this is because we know that LT2 is the turning point before lactate becomes exponential, and also VO2 max is where you're using the maximum amount of oxygen possible at a given intensity, or at a high intensity, I guess. So everything in between that, we've spiked our lactate, but we're also not running fast enough to be at VO2 max. And while you can do some workouts where you purposely target 90% of VO2 max in specific scenarios, I think when we think more in a broad sense, I do think that between LT2 and VO2 max is that gray zone that we want to try and avoid most of the time, not all the time, but for the most part, we do want to avoid it. Because I feel like in the gray zone, we're compromising our ability to get the benefits from our top end speed, but also our aerobic fitness. And it's essentially a bit too fast, but we're not getting the full benefit of going fast, but we're also not going slow enough to get the benefit of going slow. We're at a high lactate value because we're, again, past LT2, but we're not working hard enough. I just feel like it's a lot of excess fatigue for no reason when we're spiking our lactate but not running fast enough. If you're running fast, you might as well run really quick. LT2 is that real turning point where you want to be really strict at staying right below it or right at it, but not just above. So I hope people can see where I'm coming from, and I'd love to have more of a discussion on this as well, because I feel like it's never really clear what the true gray zone is. And at the end of the day, I actually feel like we should get rid of this notion in our head that there's this really strict gray zone, because we know that a little bit of everything is good, but if there's one little bit of intensity that I would avoid, it's definitely between LT2 and VO2 max. But if you can handle the training, then there's nothing wrong with doing a lot of work between LT2 and VO2 max as well. But it just really depends on your scenario and a lot of other factors. So as always, there's no exact answer on how you should train, but I hope this does open your mind a little bit. And I hope this does make you realize how important it is to actually stay within threshold when you're doing a threshold workout. Let's not try and mix the two. If we're doing an LT2 workout, let's try and run sensible and not spike our lactate. And if we're running VO2 max, let's make sure we're running really hard. Let's make sure we're breathing hard, and also just, giving that cardiorespiratory system a bit of a stimulus so that we do get the benefits of running quick. There's one final comment I wanted to make about the pyramidal, polarized, and double threshold models and intensity distribution. Like I alluded to earlier in this video, I think it does really depend on where you are in the season and a lot of other factors. So don't try and buy into one sort of philosophy and kind of do it forever. Like, don't think double threshold is king. You should always do threshold and completely forget about VO2 max and stuff. There are times where you could benefit a lot more from having a VO2 max focus for about 6 to 8 weeks, and then going back to just threshold for a bit, and then coming back to VO2 max a bit later on so that you get that VO2 max a bit quicker than you did last time. And also you can push that VO2 max a bit further up and build more of that leeway to improve your threshold after that again, so that's a constant cycle of improving something, because there's always going to be some sort of limiting factor in your training, and that's going to change over time. You're not always limited by the same thing, hopefully. If you're working on everything, you'll always have something else that's holding you back, and the thing that's holding you back the most is what you should be focusing on in order to become a better runner. So if you think of your training holistically, you'll realize that there's no one perfect way to train, and it's going to depend on the person, and being smart about your training will help you out. But I do think that keeping track of your intensity distribution is quite beneficial, and while I don't do it, I know that other runners like Jake Barkla from Ran to Japan, he actually keeps an Excel spreadsheet of his intensity distribution every week.
I've got an Excel spreadsheet just with I'm keeping it old school, proper old school, just with I use it like a training diary to like plan what's coming up, but then also I can look back 6 months ago and see, when I was running my best, this is what I was doing. And also I track every week the percentage of easy running to steady running to hard running, and try and get like a pyramid. So it's like what, 50 or 60% easy, 30% steady, 10% hard, something like that. And try and keep that week on week. So it's like if I suddenly see, I've hit like 40% hard running this week, it's like, that's asking for an injury or like a burnout. So having that just like keeps it pretty consistent.
Okay. You should definitely make a video on that. That's quite interesting.
Yeah. You are self-coached, right? So
it's also my training. Yeah, it's my own. My coach setting my training is that's me. That's me. I go through and then check it the next day. I've set myself that. Good to go.
He obviously follows a bit of a pyramidal model, and I'm sure that does change depending on the time of season. But I think for the most part, when he's doing maintenance weeks, he's like trademark 250k weeks. Train harder, not smarter. Yeah, with that, he is keeping track of his intensity distribution just to make sure he doesn't overdo it, because he doesn't want to do too much speed, and he wants to keep track of how much he's doing at a low and moderate intensity. So I think if you want to go all in on the stacks and whatnot, I think it could be beneficial to know what you're doing at any given point. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching this video. Leave a like, comment below what you thought, and also let me know what other videos you want to see in the future. And also obviously make sure to subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And as always, there's a link to my Buy Me a Coffee in the description, where you can donate anything from $5 up to anything you want, just to support the channel. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.